pay public tribute to my predecessor, Robert Petit, who is also here today. I have the benefit of the very solid foundations that he laid of the office, which I now lead with my Cambodian counterparts. So I thank you, Robert, for all of your work. I want to really talk about four areas very briefly with you this morning. First of all, for the sake of the younger people and following the example of Ben Ferencz, a snapshot of the events which the court is addressing. Secondly, I'll talk very briefly about the type of court, because actually the court in Cambodia is unique amongst all of these courts for certain reasons. Thirdly, the cases that we are dealing with at the moment, the prosecutions that we're dealing with. And lastly, I want to talk about the legacy issues that my colleagues have talked about, capacity building of the legal profession and the judiciary in Cambodia, which is actually part of the process, part of the mission that we are going through. Anyway, quite a while before many of the younger people in this room were born, in April of 1975, a communist movement known as the Khmer Rouge seized power in what is now modern-day Cambodia. The leader of that movement is somebody that you will have heard of, Pol Pot. He died in 1998 and will in fact never stand trial for the events which certain of his colleagues within the government are charged with. The communist movement in Cambodia was inspired with the idea of creating a utopia, a new society, and actually what they created for their own people was a living nightmare in which up to 2 million people perished in the space of 3.5 years. The Khmer Rouge commenced their regime by evacuating all of the people from the cities into the countryside to work on farming cooperatives, where over the space of 3 years people were starved to death and worked to death. Like most extreme regimes, eventually they began to devour themselves. They saw traitors everywhere. They blamed the failure of their communist system on people within the system trying to basically destroy the revolution. So they created security camps, the most notorious one being S21 in Phnom Penh, where they tortured and murdered people. They essentially exterminated all of the educated people within the country, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, members of the government, members of the previous government. So in essence, by the time the regime had finished, they basically eliminated the entire middle class of the country. Anybody with an education essentially vanished within this period of time. They exterminated to the level of genocide the Vietnamese minority that were living in the country, and also the Muslim minority known as the Cham. It took the best part of 20 years for the court to be actually created, mainly because of the reasons that Ben Ferencz was talking about, because of the ongoing Cold War. So in the early part of this decade, discussions between the United Nations and the Cambodian government led to an international treaty which created the court, but the court is actually unique in that it's actually the product of domestic legislation. So it's not an international court, it's actually a court within the Cambodian legal system, created by domestic legislation within the Parliament of Cambodia. And it's actually staffed by both nationals and internationals. So I have a counterpart with whom I work, Chia Liang, who is a Cambodian prosecutor. In fact, she's also the prosecutor in the Supreme Court of Cambodia, but she's my counterpart. We work together. So every position within the court that's occupied by international has a mirror image with a national. We have to work together, and we have to try and achieve consensus in moving the court forward, which is often not without problems. It's also a court that is exclusively based on civil law as opposed to common law. All of the other courts, apart from the International Criminal Court, which is basically a mixture of both common law and civil law, are based on the Anglo-Saxon common law system, the system that you're used to in the United States and I am in the United Kingdom. But the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, is a civil law court. This means that the prosecution, unlike the other international courts, do not conduct the investigations. This is done by an investigating magistrate, as in France. My job as the prosecutor, and the job of my predecessor, was to simply make an introductory submission to the investigating judges, setting the parameters of an investigation, basically an introductory investigation, and the investigating judges then investigate. And indeed, you'll see in a moment that the next case on the docket, they've been investigating that for nearly 2 years. That investigation has come to an end. The first case that the court addressed was last year, and we got the verdict for that case on July 26th, last month. And that was the trial of a man known as Khmer Rouge, who was the commander of the camp that I've already mentioned, S21, the main murder and torture chamber of the Khmer Rouge regime in Phnom Penh, where upwards of 12,000 people perished in the space of about 2.5 years. Now, he was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was convicted, ultimately, of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and he was sentenced to 35 years imprisonment, which was subsequently reduced to 19 years because he had already served some time in pre-trial detention, and also because he'd been illegally detained by the present government in Cambodia for almost 10 years, and he was actually given credit for that period of detention. So ultimately he's ended up with a sentence of 19 years, of which the population in Cambodia is not happy with that level of sentence. He is 67 years old. Frankly, if he serves 19 years, the likelihood is he will die in prison. But we have appealed that sentence, essentially arguing that the court did not take into account the gravity of the crimes that he committed. And we've made various other technical appeals in respect of the findings in terms of the offence, which I won't go into here. The next trial, the second case, which I just mentioned, the investigation in that case has come to an end. We, the prosecution, have just filed what is known as our final submission, which is essentially our summary of the case. It's about 1,000 pages long, in fact it's 931 pages, almost 6,000 footnotes, setting out all of these events. And bearing in mind, we are just dealing with a snapshot of what happened. I mean, we cannot possibly deal with all of the crimes that happened across the country. Essentially, the investigation, our recommendations and what the judicial investigation is conducted is an investigation of the most serious events. And indeed, that's common for all of these courts represented here today. It's simply impossible that you'd have trials lasting 20 years if you were to deal with all of the events. This trial, this next trial, which, as I say, we hope will begin in April of next year, involves the 4 most senior living members of the Khmer Rouge regime. Nun Chia, who was the deputy to Pol Pot, the deputy secretary of the Communist Party. Khieu Samphan, who was the president of what was then Cambodia, known as Democratic Kampuchea. Yang Seri, who was the foreign minister, and his wife, Ying Tarit, who was the Minister of Social Affairs. We have charged them, we've recommended charging them in our final submission with the genocide of the Vietnamese and Cham people, and with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and uniquely amongst these courts with national crimes, because Cambodian law also applies. So we are recommending charging them with murder and torture under Cambodian law. We anticipate the trial will last hopefully not more than 2 years, but we're dealing with 4 elderly people, all of them in various levels of ill health. I wish they had the spirit and health of Mr. Ferenczi, but they don't. So I think we're going to have serious problems in terms of how long they can actually sit during any day for a trial. So as I say, that will begin in April of next year. We anticipate that will go on for a period of about 2 years. There is also a third and a fourth case. I can't name the individuals who we have recommended to the investigating judges should be investigated, but it involves 5 individuals. The investigation of that case by the investigating judges actually commenced several months ago.